friends, and warm welcome to Focus on Africa, October the 2nd, 2019. We have a good program for you today. My name is Jennifer Pills, and I'm the new director of the Africa Hub, and we're so glad to have you here and participating in our events. Focus on Africa was started 4 years ago. The program was a partnership between the Division of Applied Social Sciences in Kaffner and the Bonn Life Science Center's Life Science Society program. We would like to thank today's sponsors, the MU Office of Research and Kaffner International Programs, directed by Dr. Kerry Clark. CIP provides capacity building and development assistance to global partners and facilitates global engagement for MU students and faculty. And when you came in, you saw a survey on your chair. We really appreciate your feedback if you have time to fill that out. And when you leave, there's a box back on the table. Just slip it in there. Next, I would like to introduce Barry Tuka Biquet. He is a third-year doctoral student in the Environmental and Development Economics Emphasis area of the Division of Applied Social Sciences, and he's also pursuing a minor in International Development. He received his master's degree in economics at the University of Missouri St. Louis before coming to the zoo. And prior to that, he worked on some agriculture development-related projects with the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture in Nigeria. Let's give Barry Tuka a warm welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, so today we are honored to have two researchers who will be presenting their work. They have 20 minutes each, and after that we'll have about 3 minutes of questions and answers, so just keep your questions to the end of their presentations. The first is Chuka Nestor Emezue. He's a PhD student, Sinclair Fellow and Delta Omega National Honoree at the University of Missouri School of Nursing. He holds a master's degree in public health policy from the School of Health Professions and a master's in public affairs from the Harry S. Truman School of Public Affairs. His transdisciplinary research agenda examines topical issues in gender-based intimate partner and domestic violence, specifically focusing on improving intervention design for male bachelors matched to early prevention efforts for young males. His secondary focus involves field testing and adapting internet-based and app-based safety planning interventions and smartphone apps that support survivor safety planning. The title of his presentation today is Culturally Differentiated Bachelor Intervention Programs for Immigrant Male Bachelors. Please give a warm welcome to Chuka.
That was an amazing introduction. Thank you so much. And before I start, I just want us to give a round of applause to Jennifer, Yanu, Tuka, Nadej, and everybody who put this event together. Please, a round of applause. They labor of love. They have reliably been doing this work for years now. My name is Chuka, simply Chuka, and I am a non-nurse nursing PhD student. I have a public health background and a non-nursing background. My research specifically is on domestic violence, but I'm looking at the other side of the spectrum, looking at men. So men who abuse female partners, men who abuse male partners. I'm also looking at men who are victims or survivors of domestic or intimate partner violence. And that's good. All right. If you forget everything I say today, I just want you to remember 3 things. Yeah. Firstly, I want you to remember the definition and prevalence rates of intimate partner violence. I want you to remember what partner intervention programs are, what they're about. Thirdly, I want you to remember how immigrant men are impacted by 2 of these things and how they fit into the picture. I should also say some of the conversation, I think of this as a conversation, but sometimes it may be distressing or traumatizing for people in the room. If you feel like you want to get up and go outside and catch your breath, it is fine. I do crave your indulgence, but discretion is advised. Intimate partner violence. We know this in several forms, in several formats. It's very, very prevalent in the media these days. We also often think about certain types of people who are more likely to be male abusers. This is the agreed upon definition of intimate partner violence, which essentially is an intentional, systematic form of criminal, assaultive, abusive behavior, usually perpetrated by a man against a female partner, although we do have different types and different forms. Speaking of different forms, we have physical, sexual, psychological forms of abuse. We also talk about stalking behaviors. We also talk about something called femicide, which is the intentional homicide of a female partner by a current or ex-partner. It is more prevalent than we talk about, and it's more prevalent than we think. However, there are immigrant-specific forms of intimate partner violence. It's right there, I'm not going to read it out. I want us to pay attention to some of the things we already are aware of in how those manifest in our real lives, and some of the things that may stand out to us as, things you're hearing for the first time. The statistics are over there, I'm not going to read that in the interest of time. Just know that I think of this as a public health and human rights issue, as many people also think about it as a social justice issue as well. The numbers. Essentially, we have about 43.7 million immigrants in the U.S. This is an underestimated number because this captures essentially documented immigrants. However, what I want you to think of from there is immigrants make up such a big group in the U.S. that we're near equivalent the numbers of other minoritized groups like African Americans, very close to Hispanic Americans as well. Immigrant men, as at the last check, make up about 52% of migrants in the context of forced or voluntary immigration. So most of us in this room are international students like myself. We are here voluntarily. Forced migration would encompass refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced people for whatever reason. You may pick your choice: climate refugees, war and conflict, famine, persecution, so on and so forth. Lifetime intimate partner violence rates for women is as high as 60%. For immigrant women, is as high as 60%. We do measure something called lifetime rates and past year rates. Past year rates are near comparable to what we call native-born women or US-born women for intimate partner violence. Married immigrant women are more likely to experience intimate partner violence, which I should have said at the beginning, is violence between people in a relationship. It may or may not be a romantic relationship. It may or may not be a current, ongoing relationship. However, in the context of marriage, the rates of IPV, or the likelihood of IPV, really skyrockets. In terms of perpetration, this is one of the studies I usually refer to, the study by Gupta in 2010, talking about perpetration rates. Essentially, what that is trying to say is that immigrant men who have been in the U.S. At least 6 years, or less than or equal to 6 years, have a lower perpetration rate, so they're less likely to abuse their partner at 16%, compared to immigrant men who have been here for longer at 23.9%. And then if you compare those groups to non-immigrant men, it's at 26%. The outcomes of intimate partner violence, I'm not going to go in depth into this. I just want you to take out from here that it does span biopsychosocial continuum. Okay, so from talking about gastrointestinal, reproductive, musculoskeletal issues, all the way to the socioeconomic cost of intimate partner violence. I'm not going to do a poll, but if we really searched our lives, we know someone, or know someone who knows someone who has experienced one of those forms of violence we talked about, if we haven't experienced it ourselves. So it's such a prevalent issue, and these are some of the outcomes. Specifically looking at immigrants, I tried to compile a comprehensive list. This is not a comprehensive list. However, what I want to take away from this slide and the next slide is all the risk factors that immigrants specifically face. This risk factor could be pre-migration while they're in the host country. The next slide is going to talk about post-migration risk factors. I do not touch risk factors that they experience during migration, which is a whole TED Talk by itself. Pre-migration risk factors, essentially political violence, war and conflict, patriotism, which is, we come from very, very highly patriarchal environments. And so sometimes those things come over. There's a spillover, rigid gender norms, rigid gender roles. There's a spillover in their host countries as well. Those are risk factors that happen prior to migration. History of family violence is such an important thing. Intergenerational violence as well. A child grows up in a home where the dad is abusive, the dad grew up in a home where his dad was abusive. Some of the post-migration risk factors are listed here. Some of the things that do stand out. I mean, we've probably heard about some of these things, but some of the things I want you to remember: dependent visa status. Usually the visa sponsor is the man who brings along his wife and his kids and his family. Those people are considered according to U.S. law as dependents. Sometimes there are policies that prevent them from being completely empowered in their host country. For example, they cannot get a job. Sometimes, while those policies are enforced by the government, they can be enforced by the abusive partner, preventing the partner from getting a job, preventing her from making a friend. I'm saying how because we have more likely to be victims. We do have men who are victims as well. Household decision making, gender roles change. There's something called downward social mobility. You come to your host country and you cannot transfer the qualifications and proficiencies you had in your original country because they count for nothing in your host country, and that automatically takes you to a lower earning capacity. Divorce stigma, such a big deal back home in Africa. I'm from Nigeria, West Africa, but it's such a big deal that familism plays off. Familism essentially means however bad it gets, you must ensure that family preservation is topmost in the priority. So irrespective of the level of abuse, brutality, and the duration of abuse, immigrants are more likely to want and seek family preservation instead of anything else. So, knowing all we know now, my research was trying to figure out battery intervention programs that are designed to cater to and reform abusive men in the U.S. That's what we call them, battery intervention programs, or BIPs is what I'm going to call them. Immigrant men also are admitted to these programs too as well. I mean, there's a high influx of immigrants, and you'd expect a high representation of immigrant men in battery intervention programs. So I was trying to figure out, we knew, and if you didn't know, the backstory is that battery intervention programs in the U.S. have very, very minimal treatment effect. Essentially, that means that when a man goes through the program, which could last anywhere from 12 to 52 weeks, he comes out reformed, maybe for the first 3 months or the first 3 years in some studies. But there's a high chance that he will go back to his abusive ways, re-assault. There's a very high level of recidivism. So I was trying to figure out if this battery intervention programs weren't working for American men, native-born men, how are immigrant men coping in those programs? Battery intervention programs, I should say, came out of the women's movement, the 70s and the 80s. I'm not going to read what's up there, but essentially that push for equality, gender equality in the US and around the world was kind of what created that traction to get battery intervention programs in place. Battery intervention programs are supposed to hold these men accountable, are supposed to try to reform them, but they're supposed to ensure the safety of the women involved, the women and the children involved in that relationship. The current state of battery intervention programs, I did mention, I gave a little bit of a historical context. There are about 2,500 battery intervention programs in the US. Many of them are closing shop every day as we speak because the government has stopped funding because they don't work. And let me not say they don't work. Let me speak like a researcher. Their effects are very, very modest. we could run the numbers on the drug treatment effects and how useful that is. They're supposed to provide comprehensive treatment and rehabilitation. Very, very big deal. Rehabilitation is such a big deal. We no longer think about it as treatment, in that you're treating a psychopathology for a crazy guy, right? We're looking at reforming thinking influenced by the environment. So an ecological approach to think about violence. The duration I mentioned, 12 to 52 weeks. However, this particular study that came out in 2018 did put the recidivism rate at 20 to 30%. So the rate at which they go back to re-abuse, I think that is a gross underestimation, and depends on who you're talking to. High rates of non-completion, and even when they complete, high rates of, low rates of treatment effects. We have moved from that whole psychopathological standpoint. We were trying to treat the little tiny demons in the abuser's head. We had moved from that model to a social model where we're considering social cultural influences that may predispose these abusers and the victims to a situation of violence, maybe the onset of violence or the sustenance of violence. Now we are at that intersectional point, hopefully, where we're looking at how these identities intersect, how the social factors, socioeconomic factors, and just our personal identities, how that makes us experience violence differently. I put a very cliche example there, an Arab Muslim immigrant woman. There are 4 different identities, and let me just say, you could be Muslim and not Arab, you could be Arab and not Muslim. We should calculate these things. How do immigrant men fare in these programs? I did an integrative review, I'm not going to go into the spiel, essentially searched formal databases and any formal database to figure out studies that were published on immigrant men in battery intervention programs. And if you look at the flow chart right there, after a comprehensive search, if I could say so myself, we found 8 studies. We found 11 studies, but we dropped some of them along the way, and we're left with 8 studies that met our inclusion criteria. Some of the search terms, if anybody wants to replicate this research, I should just say immigrants and immigration is defined very differently across board. You could call them immigrants, you could call them migrants, you could call them seasonal workers, and all of that. These were our inclusion criteria, looking for studies that were published between 1990 and 2018. I'm just going to skip along. Immigrant male batterers were compared to non-immigrant male batterers in some of the studies, and violent immigrant male batterers were compared to non-violent men. We identified 8 studies, like I mentioned, most of them were cross-sectional studies. We did find some qualitative studies of mixed method, one mixed method study and quasi-experimental studies, so like a pre-post-test situation. 7 of those studies were conducted in the US with men in the US, immigrant men in the US, and 1 was conducted in Spain. They had a study for men in Canada, but that was dropped along, even though I thought it was an interesting study. So the population were Mexican, Hispanic men in like single groups. Studies that had mixed population had a combination of some of these ethno-racial groups and people from different countries and parts of the world. Characteristics of immigrant male batterers, low to high education levels. The age for men in this program was 17 to 79, an average age of 34. U.S. residency was between 18 months to 17 years. Typology for abusers were what we call situational abusers, so men who abuse think of it as acutely from time to time. These men are also more likely not to be abusive outside the home. They're in the home, they're only abusive within. The theoretical foundations for some of these programs. So these programs are designed like school. So there's a curriculum that guides how the program is run for however long it runs. We had studies who use what we call the Toulouse model. I'm not going to go into details about the Toulouse model. Let me just say it is one of the foremost early curricula that was developed for battery intervention programs. There is a lot of critique about that particular program because it came from a feminist psychoeducational standpoint. Simply put, they did not take into account the social ecology of the men in the battery intervention programs, where they're coming from, the socioeconomics and all of that. Intervention language were usually bilingual. It was either English or Spanish. African men were in these programs, by the way, so they automatically were taught in English. Facilitators were also bilingual. And cultural competency, whatever you call cultural competency they tried to infuse that into some of these programs to make them more, to increase treatment uptake for the battery abusive immigrant men in these programs. They were focus group style. They were delivered using role play, video vignettes, group discussions, educational programs, even social games, just to try to reach men at different learning levels and styles. A particular study, only 2 studies had African men in their population. One study had about 480 men, but I should say that's a combination of studies across the years. So they gathered a very large database for men across 8 years. The second study had about 150 men. This is a study that was conducted in Spain. By the way, they have a lot more, about 50% of men in battery intervention programs in Spain are immigrant men. A study that we dropped, the Zimbabwe study, was a study conducted in Canada. And these were 2 quotes that did stand out to me, quoted by African men in the study. African men have privileges in African countries. Men tend to dominate here. Women find a better status that can create problems. Another participant said, participants saw it as problematic for men that women and children have this right to call 911 at will. They were not used to this gender equalized environment. Risk factors, dependency, attachment styles, unwillingness to change, and I should point out attitudes towards white people. So machismo and Marianismo. Machismo put men as providers, protectors, the whole concept of toxic masculinity as we know it. Marianismo put the women as submissive and wifely. And this created a petri dish for intimate partner violence. Essentially, knowing all of these risk factors found from the studies, they tried to create entry points for future intervention. Looking at fatherhood, looking at spirituality, looking at family preservation. So instead of saying these things were bad, how do we modify them? How do we use them from a strengths-based perspective to make sure that uptake, completion, and participation in these programs were increased? The Bible, participant included the Bible, wife is submissive to your husband, husband is the head or the neck, stuff like that. A facilitator quoted another part of the Bible to sort of correct without shaming that participant, right? And husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. There are verses like this in the Quran too as well. I'm not putting religion on the pedestal. I'm just saying sometimes it does help sustain these things. For the future, I'm not going to go into the slides. I think that essentially is all I have.
I see someone very eager to ask a question.
I happen to be in health economics. What is the economic, health-wise, economic impact of all these, should I call them sociological factors?
Yes.
Battery?
You could call them that. I always like this part where we talk about economics because there are numbers. I think that's it right there. This is maybe a 4 years late estimate that puts the economic cost at $3.6 trillion per annum in the US alone. Now, how does that happen? Think about lost productivity at work. Think about medical, clinical, legal services for the victim and the perpetrator as well. They did also break down by victim, and for men and women, $103,000 for women, about $23,000 for men, which kind of tracks back to the prevalence rate as well. So economically, it is taking money out of our pockets. You know, governments are not sponsoring intervention programs because the treatment effects are minimal. However, this, as of 2014, it was at 3.6 trillion cost to invest.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
So if I followed your first slide correctly, the shorter the period immigrants were in the United States, the less they were inclined to violence. The longer they were here, the more their violence level reached the same of native-born men. Is that correct?
Almost to the state of native-born. Native-born men are
Still a little higher, right? So what explains that in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's we do call this the period of acculturation, where they're trying to get used to the environment. Both the man and the women are unaware of the resources in the environment. They're unaware of the temperature of that environment. They're unaware of the policies of the day. So in that so-called period, the men were least likely to abuse their women. Also, some of the men had come by themselves and had spent a substantial amount of time here before they brought their family on, and that tracks into the 6 years too as well. So, yeah, it did seem like a counter situation, right? You'd expect their head language, linguistic skills are low, and then they're more likely to have what we call acculturative stress, and that's really to impact violence. But they found it's not the case. Now, some other researchers have the exact opposite viewpoint in this field. And we have a lot of back and forth in the field of domestic violence as to what exactly is what.
Have you considered the possibility that during this acculturation period, the women are less likely to report any instance of domestic violence because, number one, they are not aware of their rights. Number two, they are not aware of the consequences of reporting because it might impact negatively on the family. So I would propose that it's likely that there is huge underreporting of incidents, as in most cases of crimes in society, within the family. They don't get reported in the first few years.
I mean, you just hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what's going on. I did mention that there's a vastly underestimated numbers. Immigrant women do not report, period. Irrespective of how long they've been in the U.S., there are several things to consider. Their hair's dependence on their primary sponsor, which is usually their husband. They're worried about their child if they report. They're worried about deportation and hypervigilance. They're worried. In fact, they just are more likely to have this distrust in legal actors and law enforcement based on past encounters in their home countries. So you don't want to upset that balance. You're worried about your family and just preserving your family in general. So yes, the short answer is they do underreport. They vastly underreport. And underreporting varies per type of violence. Also, when women know the resources that are available to them, they're very afraid because sometimes the push is you have to extricate yourself from that relationship, which may not always be helpful. In fact, women are more likely to be murdered during the period when they're trying to exit the relationship, both immigrant and native born.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, we're out of time now. Please, if you have any other questions, feel free to meet the presenter. Let's put our hands together for Chuka once again.